their traditional practices in confronting our present climate crisis. So with that, YCAN, we're an independent community group based in the city of Yarra that exists to inspire urgent action in response to the climate emergency. So one of our key aims within that ambit is to foster awareness and build skills within the community. And so that's where this webinar comes in. So we appreciate you taking some time out on a weeknight to broaden your knowledge in a really meaningful way. We're very excited because this is the first it's the first webinar we've hosted over Zoom. So we're experimenting with this technology for the first time and really optimistic that it'll be a great way for us to be able to expand our reach to new audiences. And so because of that optimism, we're scheduling a number of these sessions. So this is just the first in what we're calling the Climate Solutions webinar series. So on the third Wednesday of each month at 7 o'clock. So same as this time slot for the next few months, we'll be running similar sessions, and we certainly hope that you can join us again. And just you can, via our newsletter and via our Facebook, you can keep track of what those topics will be, and we might even give you a preview at the end as to what the next topic will be. So the last thing I'll do is I'll briefly explain how the session will run. So to ensure things run as smoothly as possible, we're going to pop everyone on mute, as Taryn said. So if you do have a question, please share it using the chat function, which you'll see a chat icon hopefully along the bottom of your screen. There should be a series of icons at the bottom of the Zoom window, one of which is a chat function. So if you click on that, you can type a question into there. We're going to pause at several points during the presentation and field these questions. So if you're comfortable, we'll call out your name and you'll have a chance to read out your question in person at the right time. Another thing to note, that this session will be recorded and uploaded to our website after the session so that we can share it as widely as possible. And if anyone has any issues with the technology, hopefully the chat function still works. Feel free to post a question on there that might relate to solving a technology issue you have, and we'll see whether we can resolve that for you. But with that, I'll hand over to Shane, who's one of our YCAN committee, who will introduce our guest speaker.
Sue works for the Office of the National Soils Advocate. Australia's National Soils Advocate is our former Commonwealth Governor-General, Michael Jeffrey. Australia may indeed be one of the only countries in the world with a government body tasked exclusively with promoting soil health. Sue is well credentialed to talk with us this evening, having worked as an agronomist in various states across Australia before turning to policy work in the past decade after completing a Master of Climate Change Policy at ANU. In her policy work, Sue has tackled a variety of interesting projects, including soil carbon measurement as part of various federal government climate schemes. With that, and without further ado, I'll hand over to Sue to present to us tonight. Thanks, Sue. And Karen, can you unmute Sue, please?
Agree to be unmuted. So yeah, look, it's really great to be here, and thanks for that introduction, Shane. And I'd just like to congratulate you as a group, YCAN. Just listening to what Jeff's introduction of YCAN and the group and what you're achieving to do, I think it's wonderful. I do have a master's in climate change policy, so clearly I have a super interest in this area. So thank you for the opportunity to speak. It's fabulous. So what I'll be talking about is the importance of soil health in a changing world. And in particular, I have unsurprisingly emphasised climate issues in this talk as we go. And hang on, oh, I'm pushing the wrong button. Oh, that's the button. Sorry, I'm using a different computer. So this is a little bit of an outline of my talk and what I'll be talking about. And it sort of falls into 4 broad areas. The last one obviously is cut up a little bit as well. So as Jeff was saying earlier, there'll be opportunity to ask questions really at the end of each of those sections. Anything that pops into your mind, no question's a silly question, absolutely no judgment. You can ask me absolutely anything. So what I'll start by doing is just talking about the national objective for soil health. Now, the Prime Minister does have a national objective for soil health, and that is to protect, restore and maintain the health of the agricultural landscape. And Shane said earlier that the Major General Michael Jeffrey is the National Soils Advocate. He became the National Soils Advocate in 2012, and then he was reinstated in the middle of last year when the Prime Minister gave a talk at the Dubbo Bush Summit. And in that talk, he said the word soil 39 times, which was kind of exciting because it really emphasised to me that he was serious about this national objective to protect, restore and maintain the health of the agricultural landscape. And in response, he's done 2 things. He reinstated General Jeffrey as the National Soils Advocate. And he also said that General Jeffrey would gain support through the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet by establishing an Office of the National Soils Advocate, which is me. And that's super exciting to me because this is such a wonderful opportunity to support General Jeffrey, but also to be able to do some really good extension work in the soil health area. And the other thing is to develop a national soils strategy. And that strategy has been started, but I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So here we have Major General Michael Jeffrey. Unfortunately, he isn't well, so you won't see him out and about anywhere near as much as you did. So much that he's actually an advisor to the National Soils Advocacy at this point in time, and he will be replaced in due course. But up until now, he's been an absolute stalwart. So the National Soils Advocate, undertaking broad awareness raising. Now I'm losing a little bit of my screen, so I'm just going to press a button here and see if I can, yes. Undertaking broad awareness raising by engaging with governments, land managers, industry and researchers about the importance of conserving and improving agricultural soil and landscape conditions. And really the bottom bit's the most important bit, and that is to incentivise change. Because you can talk all you like, but until there's a change in management, then we don't progress. So the reason why there is a National Soils Advocate and there is now the national objective is that the condition of our soils and the agricultural landscape is deteriorating. Now I can show you a lot of metrics on that, and I'll show you some later on, but the story is not good. Agricultural production as it is not sustainable. Farming communities are doing it tough. There's worldwide increasing population, and obviously there's food security issues which comes with that. And as soon as you've got food security issue, you've also got national security issues more broadly with regards to conflict. We're also supporting the national ambition for Australia's agricultural industry to become a $100 billion industry by 2030. That was initially proposed by the National Farmers Federation and taken on board by the federal government. So the objectives are to turn it all around, to help meet local sustainability and regenerative issues, but also improve production and support viable farming and rural communities. Ultimately, you benefit Australia's environment and biodiversity, and much more broadly again, you meet global challenges such as food security, both quality and quantity, and looking at increasing global populations, scarcity of natural resources, and of course, climate change. So, as far as the national objective for soil health, any questions to date with that?
quick one from me, Sue. I was just wondering whether the office works at all with traditional owners or Indigenous people in other ways around engagement around soil health, or is it mainly the agricultural sector?
It is mainly the agricultural sector, and those words that I have on the previous slides, they are direct quotes out of what Scott Morrison said at the Bush Summit. But I've got to admit that I sneak a little bit of Indigenous engagement in there as well, probably quite a lot actually, partly because I think it's really important that we do so. There's a heck of a lot to learn from Indigenous land management. I don't know if any of you have read the book Dark Emu by Bruce Pascoe. That's a fantastic book about Indigenous land, long-term Indigenous land management. So if you haven't, it's a fabulous book. So the answer is yes. That was a long way to say yes.
No, excellent. I also had another one, if I might be permitted. I was wondering whether so that national objective that you've set out looks like an eminently sensible objective to have. I wonder, are we generally in the international community, do you consider us to be ahead of the curve in terms of being on top of the importance of soil health and trying to improve that and make that more sustainable, or are we sort of behind, or where do you see that we sit relative to our international peers?
Yeah, well, there's a mob called the Global Soil Partnership run by the FAO in Rome, and they really deal with exactly these kinds of issues. And look, I'd say we're a good middle runner for an OECD nation. There are pockets that are really good and pockets that are really rubbish. I think that we've got sorry about that. We've got some real challenges in Australia that other countries don't have. But, it's easy to focus on, the challenges we have and not the ones that other countries have. So overall, like I say, I think we're probably a good middle runner from that point of view. So, yeah.
So I made that point at the beginning that I think are we the only country with someone who's specifically charged with advocating around soil health, or are there other countries kind of touching on what Jeff was saying? Is other countries also have such departments or have such bodies, or are other countries similarly moving ahead, or where are they?
Interestingly, I very recently wrote an article, hasn't been published yet, but it will be. It was really a tribute article to General Jeffrey, because obviously he's done some amazing work in this space. And one of the people who made a comment about Michael Jeffrey was that a chap called Dr. Michael Crawford, who is the head of the soil CRC for high performing soils. And he said he was in America the day that Julia Gillard appointed General Jeffrey to the position. And he was standing when the announcement was made, which is obviously very exciting in the soils world and internationally as well. The American soil scientists turned to Michael Crawford and said, "What did you guys get right?" They were so envious that a former Governor General had been appointed to this position. And it really meant that not only was the Australian government taking soil health seriously, but we had somebody who was this amazingly eminent person who would take on the position. And really, General Jeffrey's been such a squeaky wheel. And so that's really how it all come about. So absolute all credit to him, to that he's in the position, and that we even have the position that national position to really push soil health. Okay, so we shall move on now to the long and proud history of understanding our soils. And I really should have said a long and proud history of trying to understand our soils. So what I'll do is I'll start with some basics here, and I'll drill down to some of what are the most pertinent things with regards to soils. So here on the right, you'll see a soil profile, and you've probably all dug a hole and you realise that the soil changes. The deeper you go, the soil changes as you go down. The top layer, or the O layer, is considered the organic material, and that's often very thin in Australian soils, can be quite thick in peaty soils in Europe, can be a couple of feet thick, whereas we're lucky to get a couple of millimetres. And really that's the composted organic material that you see on the very surface. The A horizon, or the topsoil, is what is the bit that seeds need to plant to germinate, and it's quite high in organic matter compared to the B horizon. Of rocks, often roots don't go down that far, and then of course you hit the bedrock. Now there's different soils will have different depths. You know, you can get those really strong peaty earths that are 30 metres deep, all the way down to some really, really thin soils. A lot of our rangeland soils, for example, are only a foot thick, with very, very thin A and O horizons. So they're all different, but that's what you would expect to see. And quite importantly, the depth of the soil is going to impact on the quality of the types of plants that you can grow on that soil. So in Australia, same but different as the rest of the world. So our climate and our soils are different from lots of other food bowls. And yet agriculturally, we are quite competitive. We are very good at farming very poor soils with low organic matter and with low rainfall. But this is no accident. And we have a very long track record of focused support and trailblazing science. Now, I've given an example there of the Waite Institute in South Australia. We've got a number of institutes nationally, but the Waite is a very prominent one in South Australia. Like lots of other agricultural institutes, they were given a parcel of land, this one in 1924, and they were given lots of money. And that was an era in which people would bequeath their farm or a large piece of land or a lot of money, particularly pastoralists and agriculturalists that were very, very committed to the cause. And so they were set up as research centres. This agricultural institute in the Waite is strongly connected to CSIRO, to SARDI, which is the South Australian Department of Agriculture, people like the GRDC, the Grains Research and Development Corporation, the Australian Research Council, etc. You know, you're talking about reasonable sums of money there. Another $30 million came through from the South Australian government in 2010. So what it does is to support agricultural research. And I guess what I'm saying there is over time, there's been quite a lot of it. But it's always a continuing understanding, and particularly as climate changes and as our demand for different products changes over time, you can't assume that your knowledge is complete. We need to keep going, and we do. So from a soils perspective, on the left you'll see there the National Soil Research and Development Extension Strategy. That was written in 2015, and it was a 10-year strategy. And that is being delivered at the moment. And it really talks about what we're doing in the soil space with regards to RD&E. So talking a little bit about the soils themselves, the research splits into three areas: the chemistry, the physics, and the biology. Now, historically, the chemistry has been most studied. The physics has been reasonably studied, and the biology less so. And that's certainly something that is being flipped on its head at the moment. So soil chemistry is what happens to the nitrogen in the soil. How do you get enough nitrogen into your plants? Is there enough magnesium in the soil? You know, and all of the chemistry that sits behind that. A lot of it, funnily enough, was driven by the fertilizer industry. Soil physics is looking at things like compaction, pore space, how plants' roots will grow through the soil, those types of things, how water is absorbed and how efficiently it can be pulled up through the plant. And that, of course, depends on the soil texture, which is part of the soil physics. Now, the soil biology is really what I'm going to focus on this evening, partly because it's super interesting, but also I think it's where the greatest interest lies in the soil health space and in the pursuit of change. So if we have a little look here about the relationship between soil, plants, organic matter, birds and mammals, most of you will have studied some sort of biology with the web of life and will know how really everything is connected. And in that diagram, you can see there that, you know, you've got your plants and then you start getting into that second level there with nematodes, fungi, bacteria, and they really go down, you know, down the line there until you get to the birds and the animals in the soils. So it's really looking at that web, and there's a lot of arrows that go from one to the other. One feeds the next in the usual web of life sort of style. But of course, this is talking about a soil. So what we've learnt is that soils are the most complicated biomaterial on the planet. However, it's really quite understudied, as I was saying earlier, and our knowledge is incomplete. And that contrasts to the huge amount of information that we have about above ground biology, and particularly that soil plant interface is still in the soil biology space is quite patchy. So if you have a look at the diagram on the right, I find this quite fascinating where, you know, you've got one vertebrae, 100 slugs in a square metre of soil. You've got some earthworms and potworms, 3,000 of them. And then you've got some insects, and then you move down to your rotifers and tardigrades and the other, you know, moving down on that triangular pyramid. And then you come down to bacteria and you've got, you know, a million of them per square metre of soil. So that's really an unbelievably large number. So looking a little bit more here about into soil biology, and that is to say that fertile soils teem with microorganisms and they directly contribute to that biological fertility of the soil. They play really essential roles in the nutrient cycling, and they're absolutely fundamental to life on Earth. In the past, we've actually, most of our agricultural practices have failed to promote healthy populations of these microorganisms. And we know now that that is limiting production, it's reducing soil carbon, and most certainly threatening sustainability. So what we're doing now is a lot of scientific research is looking into soil biology and some of the super exciting possibilities as far as restoring and promoting some of those healthy soil microbial populations. And I don't know about you, but you probably didn't listen to anything I was talking about. You probably listened to this funky little guy on the left, a tardigrade. This is otherwise known as a soil water bear. An 8-legged creature that's about 1 millimetre long, and he goes through particularly through peat areas and areas that got a lot of peats and mosses in them, and cruises along cleaning up lots of little floaties in the soil water. So, and I reckon he's kind of funky. So going on to soil organic carbon, you saw where that sat in the soil profile. There's really 3 different sorts. There's the labile, the slow and the stable. So when you have a look at first on the left there, the labile, that's a very, it's a very moving, fast moving pool of carbon in the soil. And that's fresh residues and living organisms. They last between 1 to 5 years. And it's all the organisms we were talking about earlier, as well as things like all of your plant roots. And then you get the humus organic carbon, which is more resistant, and it tends to be physically protected. And moving down to the resistant organic carbon and charcoals, which are stable between 500 and 1,000 years. So they're quite long-lived in the soils. And that's where biochar lives, which was something that I understand that you'll be talking about later. So if we have a look at our understanding of the mechanisms in soil organic matter formation, they are changing, and they're changing quite swiftly. For a long time, we thought that the soil organic matter formation was really a function of the plant input, mainly through the roots, and the chemistry that sat between that soil-root interface. And that stable organic matter was seen as the preservation of the biochemically recalcitrant complex plant polymers. So really the last things to degrade as far as your organic matter was concerned. But more recently, soil microbial populations are being recognised as adept at decomposing a wide range of compounds and using all sorts of different carbon sources to synthesise their own biomass. So the importance of soil microbes in generating soil matter, soil organic matter, has really been only recently recognised in that big picture. And it's partly because we can see it better. So if we have a look at what determines the soil carbon content, the soil type makes a lot of difference. If you've got a lot of clay in your soil, it tends to bind to the soil organic matter, protect it from being broken down because there's limited access to those microbes. And alternatively, if you've got a very coarse textured and sandy soil, the organic matter that is there is not protected from microbes, and it tends to degrade quite quickly. So there's nothing you can do to change what your soil type is, how much clay you've got, how much loam, how much sand. Your climate is going to be a large determinant of your soil organic matter. When you look at increased rainfall is going to assist with soil organic matter. Obviously, increased rainfall means you've got greater plant growth and you've got more organic matter accumulating in the soil. And it does so for a longer proportion of the seasons, because in Australia, particularly in the Mediterranean climate, when there's no rainfall for 4 or 5 months every year, which is really lots of parts of South Australia and West Australia, yeah, there's no organic matter input at all. And then if you look at temperature, you'll see that low temperatures mean that the soil organic matter degrades and decomposes more slowly. And you'll find, obviously, if it's warm and it's then it'll be more rapid. And that's why these enormously deep peat bogs occur in the Arctic tundra and just below there in Russia and the like, because the temperatures are so low for such a long time that the organic matter doesn't decompose and it just builds up and builds up. So the first two things there, the soil type and the climate, clearly you get what you're given. That's it. But the soil and land management actions make a lot of difference. So what you can do is maximise your crop and pasture biomass going into the soil. You can maximise your water use efficiency through organic management so that you get a greater organic matter input. And what you'll find is that if there's less erosion, that also helps as well. The tillage of soils will decrease. Every time you till soil, you introduce oxygen, you break up lots of hyphae and old root matter, and you'll find that the organic matter metabolizes much more quickly. So that makes a lot of difference. So it decomposes quite quickly. You can add off-farm organic residues, things like manure, straw, biochar. They all can increase the organic matter. It may or may not be economic, but that's how you achieve it. And then there's some other things there that can be considered as well. They're mainly to do with adding organic matter to the soil, reducing erosion, those types of things, and making sure you get good plant growth. So I've talked mostly about soil organic carbon as a soil health factor, and there's three really important reasons why we focus on soil organic carbon as a soil health measure, and also more broadly. So first of all, looking at productivity, you get a fascinating double effect in that higher soil organic carbon delivers higher productivity, and higher plant growth and productivity delivers higher soil organic matter. So you get a positive feedback loop. The more you grow, the more soil carbon you have. So if you have a look there at that graph, you can see that, that along the bottom, you've got changes in the soil carbon pool and productivity growth. So really demonstrating the higher the more growth there is, the more soil carbon there is. So looking at soil health, that you get increased water holding capacity, you get greater infiltration of rainfall, greater drought resistance, less runoff and erosion, less nutrient loss, you can reduce your farm chemical input, and you get better animal health and well-being outcomes. So that's another reason to focus on soil carbon. And having a look at this little picture here, you can see on the left where that soil has got poor organic carbon and poor growth, and you'll see that there's a lot of runoff and it's quite dirty, and that is mainly, it'll be soil organic material that slips straight through the soil, hasn't been caught with the soil, and all the way through to the very right where you've got some plant cover there, and higher organic carbon in the soil, and you'll find that it's hanging onto the soil, hanging onto the water better, which holds the water in the landscape, which increases your plant growth. So there's that positive feedback as well. So the third reason is benefit to the atmosphere. If you have a look at that diagram on the right, you'll see that the soil organic carbon is the third biggest pool of carbon in our biosphere. So you can see the ocean, the big blue one, is the biggest pool. Fossil fuels, let's not talk about them. Then there's the atmosphere, and we understand about the carbon dioxide content in the atmosphere. But if you look at the pedologic pool, the soil organic carbon and the soil inorganic carbon, you'll see there's twice as much carbon in soil organic carbon than there is in the atmosphere, and probably nearly 3 times as much as there is in the plants and animals. So what you're saying there is fairly small changes in soil organic carbon can have a really enormous change on the atmospheric pool when you're looking at the carbon dioxide content. So soil is a really good place to store carbon. So we come to a little bit of a break, a long and proud history of understanding our soils and soil carbon. So are there any questions coming in against that information so far?
So actually we had a couple of questions. So I missed one shortly after your initial break, but there's a good question from Jackie in relation to soil salinity. So perhaps, Jackie, you could perhaps talk to that.
Hang on. You've unmuted me? Really, yes. It's just really the question I put in the in the chat about covering with what relationship does the organisation have with, say, the Murray-Darling Water Basin Authority, and dealing with salinity problems in soils through irrigation and excessive water use upstream for things such as rice growing and so on. Do you get into that space?
I would suggest only marginally. I think that the obviously the health of the Murray-Darling system impacts on the health of the agricultural soils in the, in that drainage basin more broadly, but we wouldn't get into things like irrigation and water allocations or crop choice, which is really what you're talking about with regards to things like growing rice and cotton in the Murray-Darling basin. So we certainly liaise with all of the other Commonwealth departments. Murray-Darling Basin Authority is one of those. Soil salinity is most certainly a soil health issue. It's something that will impact and for quite some time, and it's really to do with big picture vegetation management and also to a lesser extent water management. It's certainly very complex, and probably not something I would choose to go into in any great detail on this occasion, because of its complexity.
Okay, thanks.
And I think Jeff had a couple of questions that he wanted to pose.
I did. Thank you, Shane. So in one of your slides, you mentioned, I think it was where you were talking about the different soil types. You mentioned microbial attack.
Yep.
In my head, I was just thinking that microbes in the soil were good things. But was it microbes were attacking the organic component of the soil and degrading it? Did I understand that correctly, or have I misunderstood that?
Yeah, it's quite a complex cycle, but and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next stage, but microbes live on organic matter that's living in the soil, and the soil organic matter gets there through plant roots. So what you're talking about is either a live plant root or a freshly dead plant root gets attacked by microbes and gets eaten by microbes, and in so doing they move the soil organic matter down the line from this labile pool into the slow pool. It turns it into the fresh organic matter into humus, and over time into resistant organic carbon. So attack is possibly a word maybe I shouldn't have used. It's really part of the decomposition process. And then once that microbe reaches the end of its life, then it will become soil carbon itself. Its body becomes so. So it's all part of that web of life. Does that make sense? Did I answer that question?
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah. So it's a positive process.
Oh yes, most definitely. Absolutely. So, and it's
the word attack throwing me.
Yeah, maybe I shouldn't use that word. It's much more a symbiotic process than we've really ever realised before. And in particular, if you look at the role of fungi, which is obviously a really important thing in a soil, is that fungal hyphae will actually seek out plant roots and live on them in a parasitic manner. But it's actually a symbiosis, not a parasitic relationship, because the soil fungi pass water and nutrients into the plant roots, and in return they gain plant sugars. So that's that symbiosis. So yeah, super interesting process that we're only learning really much about now.
And Andy has a question as well.
Yeah, I'm going to have to go back and look at it. Hang on a second.
It was a question about how widely is the information that you're sharing tonight, when you go out to talk to farmers, how widely do people do farmers understand this information about soils?
There is absolutely all gamut of farmers when it comes to this type of thing. It moves from, when I was an agronomist, I worked a lot in practice change, and part of that is understanding what the original level of knowledge is and what drives people to make decisions the way they do. And in the soil space in particular, there are farmers who think, oh, look, it's just that stuff that holds my wheat crop up. I'll chuck a bit of phosphate on and it'll be fine. And there's other farmers who think in great depth about the whole of the soil health issue, not just soil carbon, but also, some of the other soil health parameters like soil acidity and soil compaction, and those kinds of things. So it's yeah, they will think very long and hard. Some farmers are extremely educated. I know farmers who've got PhDs, and I know farmers who left school at the end of year 10. They all make the best decision that they can on the day, and they all seek good advice.
How widely known, I mean, is the Office of the Soils Advocate commonly known to farmers?
Now, there's a trick question. General Jeffrey was very active in the time across the 5 years that he was most functionally operating between 2012 and 2017. So across 5 years, he estimated that he spoke to between 5,000 and 10,000 farmers. So lots and lots of farmers know General Jeffrey, and they know him as the National Soils Advocate. The Office of the National Soils Advocate supporting General Jeffrey was only instigated in the middle of last year, and I started this role in October. Since that time, General Jeffrey has not been well. Unfortunately, he has got a brain tumour, and so it would have been unhelpful of me to do a lot of promotional work on him, because he isn't in a position to do any speaking. We will get a new National Soils Advocate, and when that new person is on board, one of the things that I will be doing is a whole heap of promotional work and sort of re-promoting the position and the role of the National Soils Advocate more broadly. And including on social media and, across a lot of rural and urban press. So there will be a lot more promotion of the role in the near future, but in the meantime, I'm doing all sorts of funky, speaking engagements like this. And also, like I say, January, February, I was very busy doing lots of things like the soil conferences, crop updates, agronomy stuff. And so I was promoting from that point of view, but I've had to be a little bit cautious not to go a little bit too bull in a china shop, because General Jeffrey has not been well. So hopefully that answers the question.
And do you want to play one? So we have another question from Sarah, but do you want to continue to take questions, or do you want to play one at this stage? I'll leave it up to you.
Yeah, look, hit us with another question, and then we'll carry on.
Okay, Sarah, over to you.
Hi, yeah, I was just, my question is about the urban soil management, which I guess is a very minor player in these big agricultural issues. But I'm really interested in if you have any kind of advice about, local government initiative, what local government can do with parks and gardens and urban landscapes.
Yeah, urban landscapes, there's two sides to that coin. There's the side that says it's only a really small area and it's not that important, and we can afford to put, additional composts on, and we can grow a beautiful array of plants, and we can irrigate if we want to, those types of things. But the other side of it is that with a huge urban population, the importance of soil health getting promoted to that enormous urban population is actually a really important thing. So that's why there's two sides. There's the actual physical area side, which is less so, although there's much more chance to do amelioration. But there's that side where there's a lot of people involved, and the power of people I will be talking about on my last area of what I talk about. So I will probably leave a little bit of that to there till then.
Thank you.
Yeah. Cool. So we might press on to where are we now, and looking at soil health and what's happened in the last little while. And the story's not good. This is a global figure that in the last million years or so, 2.3 teratons of CO2 has come out of the earth and gone into our atmosphere and into our water systems. And if you have a look at this diagram, it's sort of a diagrammatic sample of how that's happened, where the pre-industrial revolution and today's carbon pools. And you'll see that there's much more in the ocean, there's much more in the atmosphere, and there's less in our plants, our soils, and our fossil fuels. So that's really an impact of human beings and of agriculture. And this is really a little schematic of what's happened to soil organic carbon with the introduction of what we would consider to be traditional or European farming techniques. So you'll see on this graph with time along the bottom from 1900 to pretty much to 2000, so a space of 100 years, the tonnes of soil carbon per hectare. So we had the conversion to agriculture. My little pointer work. Oh yeah, if you can see that, the conversion to agriculture. And then we have conventional tillage, where a crop, a soil might get tilled anywhere from 2 to probably 8 times in the process of crop establishment. And the soil carbon, as I was explaining earlier, it metabolizes, it decomposes, it gets oxidized, and it goes down and down and down. And on this particular example, this schematic, we've said that 50% of it is lost, and that is a very common figure. And there's a little upkick there from 1980 with the instigation of reduced or low-till crop establishment techniques. So you can see, even though there's a little bit of an upkick, there's still what's considered to be the soil carbon sequestration potential there. It's the difference between where the soil carbon is now and where it used to be in its natural state. So if we have a look at different soil types, and really what you could say here, the Candazole is a low fertility soil, like a really poor agricultural soil, and the solid dots there being the Vertisol, which is a really good, strong, cracking clay soil commonly used for growing cotton on in the Murray-Darling Basin, with that previous question. So you can see there what's happening with the soil organic carbon over time. It reduces significantly, and you'll see on the Vertisol, you know, it's less than half where it used to be. Soil organic carbon going typically across globally from 4.5% down to 1 or 2%, and it's still falling, it's still going down, and that is not sustainable, and that's obviously where the greatest concern of all is. So just a little, toss this in for interest really, looking at, although soil carbon levels have gone down, average wheat yields at this point in time have increased. You'll see there's a couple of step changes there with the introduction of fertiliser and different cropping techniques. You'll see there the 2 black dots are quite far down compared to the average yields from 1980 to 2000. So productivity is good, but it's plateaued, and it's predicted to actually be on a downturn now. Fertiliser usage has gone through the roof, particularly nitrogen fertiliser. Phosphorus and potassium less so, but nitrogen fertiliser obviously has increased enormously over that time. So that's a little bit of where we're up to. I think I'll probably keep going, because very linked to that is what our national opportunity is for improving soil health. And this is the bit that's exciting, and this is the bit which involves climate. So looking at and thinking about those previous graphs that I showed you, the difference between conventional farming, sustainable agriculture, and regenerative agriculture. So conventional farming or industrial agriculture, it's farming systems that include heavy use of synthetic fertilisers, a lot of pesticides, herbicides, there's genetically modified GMO crops, also concentrated animal feeding operations like feedlots, a lot of irrigation, intensive tillage, and focus on monoculture. So what most people would think of is very traditional farming. Then there was a move, it started really in about 1980, 1990, a little bit towards sustainability, where farmers and agronomists and agricultural scientists were really looking at the sustainability, going, hang on a minute, I'm not so sure that we're doing this right. You know, we're having to put more and more fertiliser on, which you saw in that graph, more and more pesticides, herbicides, disease coming in, etc. You know, really sort of looking at that sustainability. So sustainable agriculture focuses on not making things worse, looking at minimal effects on the environment. And the global goal of sustainable agriculture is to meet the society's food and textile needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So you think, oh, well, that's pretty good. You know, that's sustainable. That's pretty good. Then you think about those graphs on soil carbon, where we've at least half the soil carbon that we started with, and clearly it ended up in the atmosphere. And then you think, well, even if we can sustain that, we're still a long way down from where we came from. And this is why we are now talking about regenerative agriculture, which is a conservation and rehabilitation approach to food and farming systems, focusing on topsoil regeneration, in particular the soil carbon and the soil biology, increasing the biodiversity, improving the water cycle, holding the water in the landscape, enhancing ecosystem services like improving waterways and the biota that supports, supporting biosequestration, which is both in the soils and in plants, increasing the resilience to climate change, and strengthening the health and vitality of farm soil. So really we're moving one step further from sustainability, and we're not talking anymore in the agricultural space about keeping things as good as they have been in the sustainable sense for the last couple of years. We're talking about regenerating. It's making it better, and that's a really exciting space to be working in. So if you have a look at the difference between what I would consider to be conventional agriculture, with that beautiful picture on the left, and regenerative agriculture on the right. So instead of competing with nature and trying to have a monoculture that requires a lot of inputs and control of pests and weeds, we're trying to partner with nature. So you have much more plant diversity there. So you're trying to protect the soil instead of disturbing it all the time. Trying to move to plant systems that are based more on diversity than on monoculture. And instead of that reductionist drilling right down into aggressive agricultural techniques, it's looking at a softer and more holistic way of farming. So regenerative agriculture principles: keep the soil covered, which is planting cover crops and retaining stubble, maintaining living roots all year round, so you don't have large periods of time where the soil is bare, using no-till farming techniques, which is during your crop establishment, not tilling the soil any more than you have to, rotating crops, keeping that diversity going, maximising the plant diversity, integrating livestock, because of course they are, through their manure, they are part of the cycle, incorporating compost where possible, and also reducing those inputs. And what we've found is when you're doing those other techniques, that in fact there is a much reduced need for some of those high inputs, because like what I was saying about the fungi in the soil assisting the plant to gain nutrients and access nutrients. So really encouraging the fungi by having less fertiliser and less fungicides in the farming system. So we're also looking here, this is leading edge research that I thought I would share with you, and looking at the microbial footprint as a driver for that carbon stabilisation or increasing soil carbon. So it's saying that by reducing the soil disturbance, increasing the plant biomass inputs, and enhancing plant diversity, you're increasing your soil carbon. But the other thing that we're seeing is that those techniques actually are working to produce what's considered plant-stimulated soil pore formation. So it's little channels all through the soil where the soil roots and the soil root hairs and the fungi would drive their way through the soil and leave little channels all through the soil. And what it does is it changes how the soil carbon forms and how it's retained and not lost to the atmosphere. So it's saying that those diverse plant communities favour the development of those correct size pores, and that encourages the soil microbes. And you can see on the right that photograph is actually it's a coloured. They've coloured the microbes, but the parts that are colour are microbes within the soil. And so you're increasing your soil carbon, increasing your microbes, increasing your plant growth, increasing the soil carbon, improving the soil health, and having benefits to the atmosphere. But in this space, it's not actually a simple journey, and there's no guarantees. It's difficult. Conventional farming is actually really quite easy. You almost have a recipe. And quite a few years ago, I wrote a book called Just Add Water, and it was to do with, if you do these things, you'll grow yourself a really good and profitable wheat crop. And the only limiting factor is water. We can add the fertiliser, we can add the right varieties of wheat, we can plant at the right time, etc., and you get yourself a good crop. It was fairly simple. Farmers would probably shoot me if they heard me say that, but compared to some of the regenerative agricultural farming techniques, conventional farming is a much simpler situation. So this is a diagram actually from USA, because they've got some good data there, of the adoption of some regenerative farming principles that we've just talked about, sort of one by one there, and what has happened to the soil carbon. And you can see on the right there the soil organic carbon that on that axis goes from 0% to 4.5%. Starting at 1% in 1994, they introduced legumes, and then they introduced some clovers into the system. They introduced, as time went on, some no-till systems in the cropping rotation, and they've introduced extra clover blends. They've extended their growing season, so they've had good growing plant cover for longer. In about just before 2010 there, they've introduced animals and pollinator strips into their farming systems. They've ditched on the synthetic fertilisers, and they've introduced further clovers there in 2012. And you can see that they've taken their soil carbon from 1% to 4%. And on a tonnes per hectare basis, I think you'd be surprised how much benefit that is to the atmosphere. You can see it's a complicated system. But we have a look here. This is actually Australian data about how many tonnes per hectare of CO2 that they have sequestered by changing their agricultural practices through to more regenerative practices. So if you look on a per hectare basis, you know, like if in South Australia across 5 sites, they've increased it by let's guess at 12 tonnes of carbon dioxide per hectare. So you think 12 tonnes, that's not very much. We've got a lot of hectares across Australia. So by the time you're looking at soil carbon increases of those types of quantums, we can make a difference. Tim Reeves is a very well-renowned agricultural scientist, and the picture of him on the right winning what was called the Farrer Medal, which is one of our absolutely most prestigious awards. And very recently at the Grains Research and Development Corporation update meeting, he was talking about where to from here. He uses the term sustainable intensification rather than regenerative agriculture, but he means exactly the same thing. I didn't change it on this slide because I wanted to quote him directly. So he said here it's based on the simultaneous improvements in productivity, ecosystem health, and underpins profitability. So it's not a case of doing more of what we're currently doing, but it's saying we require significant system changes towards greater diversification for crops, forages, livestock, shrubs and trees across the landscape, regeneration of soil health, soil nitrogen, soil carbon and other key elements. And we need to improve our input use efficiency, water use efficiency, less energy-rich inputs, which by and large is fertiliser, using integrated pest management much better. And you'll see that they, in that last slide where they had pollinators, using better genetics is obviously an ongoing thing. Tim Reeves was a wheat breeder. He's saying that the role of the agronomist has changed from productivity and profitability and compliance and adding sustainability in there. And I think that as probably Australia's most eminent agricultural scientist, he is most certainly well worthwhile listening to. You can see he's not young, he's been around a long time, and he's really changed his thinking in that time to add really in a same sort of a way as a lot of agronomists have, including myself, moving not just from that productivity and profitability to really looking at sustainability and regeneration of our soils and the health of our agricultural landscapes. So I might press on actually, and we'll save questions until the end. But the opportunity for improving soil health is in negative emissions. So this is a little bit of a change of tack, but you'll see closely related. So this picture here, you have a look at costs and capacities for negative emissions. So on the right there, US dollars, sorry about that, you've got the cost of negative emissions and the potential for carbon removal out of the atmosphere. So if you have a look at things on the towards the right and towards the top, they've got good potential but are expensive, and things that are on the bottom and the left are less potential and less cost. So afforestation and reforestation, that they're not very costly, but they've got low to middle potential to sequester carbon. But if you look at, some of those other things, you can read them there. But if you look at G, soil carbon sequestration, it is both cheap as well as has got an enormous potential to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And that's because quite small, I think I was saying earlier on, quite small shifts in soil carbon content over vast areas is where the gains can be made. And this is just a little comment from what's happening in the UK. They're saying that 1/5 of UK farmland is going to be used for tackling climate change. And it'll be taken out of traditional agricultural production and moved to long-term natural carbon storage, which means growing trees and restoring soils. But in so doing, they'll increase the productivity of the land which is under conventional agriculture. So, can you get paid to increase your soil organic carbon? The answer is you can. So there's a variety of carbon offset schemes. Some of these you will have heard of and some of them you haven't, and I've only listed a few of them here. There's the Clean Development Mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol. There's an absolute plethora of voluntary schemes. The Fly Carbon Neutral program that Qantas run, one run by the UN, the European Union. There's also the Climate Solutions Fund, which is the Australian government fund. So that's the actual carbon offset scheme. And there's also a variety of what is called standards. And they are how are we going to do this? How are we going to verify that it's true, that you really are reducing the atmospheric carbon? There's the NCOS system, the National Carbon Offset Standard, the Gold Standard, and the Voluntary Carbon Standard are international standards. I think one of them actually might be Canadian. And the Carbon Farming Initiative standards, which sit with the Climate Solutions Fund, which is from the Australian government. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that, because they're the ones you've probably heard of. The Climate Solutions Fund actually used to be called the Emissions Reduction Fund, and before that it was called the Carbon Farming Initiative, which is why the standard is still called that. So under the Carbon Solutions Fund, sits the integrity principles. And what they are is a set of principles such that the person who pays for those carbon to be drawn down from the atmosphere, that they know that it is real. Because if someone says, yeah, this is going to, produce, pull down from the atmosphere a ton of carbon, well, how do you know that? So the integrity principles under the scheme, I'll go, there's 4 main ones here that I'll talk about. The first one is additionality. And that is, you don't get paid under a carbon offset scheme to do something that you are doing anyway. And that graph on the right, it shows you the percentage of farmers that have got no-till adoption. You'd remember earlier I said that reducing the amount of tillage in your crop establishment techniques will increase soil carbon. So that tells you that in 1974, pretty much nobody was doing no-till cropping. And in 2008, and obviously it's regional, I'll talk about that in a minute, up to 90% of farmers are doing no-till crop establishment. So if they're already doing it, you wouldn't create a carbon credit for doing it because you're already doing it. So there's no credit to be had there. That is with the exception, quite possibly, of that solid yellow line, which is the New South Wales Mallee and New South Wales southern areas. And that's because that soil type doesn't lend itself to no-till crop adoption. And what that means is they're probably, while it's only 50% adopted, it might mean that the other 50% don't, won't, and never will do no-till because they don't think that it's the right thing for their farming country. So I probably got a little digressed there, but that's additionality. You need to make sure that the offsets that you're paying for weren't occurring anyway. The next integrity principle is leakage. And that's a risk that an offset project will trigger an increase in emissions from another source, which means that there's no benefit to the atmosphere. And in the soil carbon space, this is particularly complex because one of the things that happens is that if you increase your soil carbon, you also, you'll see on the right there, when you increase your soil carbon, you also increase your the nitrification, denitrification process, which for those of you who are chemistry heads, which means that there's also an emission of nitrous oxide. So increases in soil carbon will draw down carbon dioxide from the air, but increase the emissions of nitrous oxide. And you will be well aware that that is also a greenhouse gas. So there may well be no benefit to the atmosphere in those sort of circumstances. So we need to be really careful with the carbon accounting that you also account for the nitrous oxide increase when you're looking at the carbon dioxide decrease due to increases in soil carbon. So that's called leakage. And there's all sorts of other examples you can think of. It's like if you reduce livestock numbers in one area, you'll decrease your methane emissions. But there's absolutely no point doing that if the bloke over the road increases their livestock numbers and increases their methane to compensate for the fact that you've decreased yours. The other thing is that any abatement needs to be accurately and conservatively measured, including a baseline. So you can imagine in the soil carbon space, if you are measuring your soil carbon, you need to start with the baseline. What are you starting with? We saw some data earlier where soil carbon went from 1% to 4.5%, which is fantastic effort, absolutely amazing. But if you don't do your baseline measurements and you don't accurately measure the baseline, then you don't know where you started, you don't know where you're going. In the soil carbon space, we're also rather conscious that this is the only way currently to measure soil carbon. You need to dig a hole. And To walk across a paddock, the soil carbon varies across a paddock quite a lot. So you need to dig quite a lot of holes so you get a good statistically accurate measurement of what soil carbon is there, which means it is expensive. But nonetheless, if it's not accurately done, then it's for a carbon offset, which is where I started, it's not going to be good. The other thing is an integrity principle is the permanence, and that is that sequestration offsets, there's a risk that the carbon will be re-emitted. And this graph on the right, you can see it's a schematic where soil carbon on the left there and time on the x-axis. You'll see that if you look at that solid line, that consistent with some of the other graphs that I've showed you, it's decreased over time with tillage. And then this in this paddock, there is conversion to pasture, which means there's no tillage and you've got permanent cover. And across 10 years, the soil carbon goes up. And you can, as a soil carbon method, you can get paid for the carbon that has been sequestered. But you can only do so if it permanently stays there. There is no benefit to the atmosphere if, as per this graph, conversion to intensive cultivation, you're back where you started from and doing lots of tillage, and you lose all the gain that you made in the soil carbon. So you need to be able to demonstrate, if you're selling carbon offsets, that when it's sequestered in the soil or in the vegetation, that sequestration is permanent. And in a soil carbon space, that is extremely difficult to do. Under the Carbon Solutions Fund, as noted, used to be the Carbon Farming Initiative and the Emissions Reduction Fund, there are two soil carbon methods. The measurement of soil carbon sequestration, and across Australia there are 45 registered projects out of the approximately 120,000 farms. Participation is obstructed by high measurement costs, permanency requirements, and quite a high administrative burden along the way. And you'll see there that I've said that the permanency requirements, if you choose to participate in this method, if you take 100-year permanence on, which is beyond our lifespan, you get full credits. Or if you take on a 25-year permanency, which is a guarantee that you will undertake that sequestration project for 25 years, you still get a 20% reduction in the number of credits that you will be awarded for doing that project. So there's a number of difficulties there. The measurement of soil carbon method was introduced about 8 years ago. And like I say, there's 45 projects Australia-wide. There is another method, the estimating sequestration of carbon in soil using default values, which is a model-based carbon sequestration. There's a model, it's called FullCam, where you can punch a whole lot of numbers in and change your farming methods, which will, according to the model, increase your soil carbon. So instead of digging all the holes and measuring it, you're modelling it. But there's a fairly heavy discount involved in that due to the the uncertainty around the impact of the abatement activities. And at this point in time, this model, this has been around about 5 years, and there are no participants at this point in time. And really that's to do with the fairly heavy discounts and the scientific uncertainty about the abatement that you will achieve, because the model is quite, it's not tight. So the next question, and this is the good bit from your perspective, what to do? Because a lot of what I have presented in this last section here about opportunities to improve soil health, regenerative agriculture, negative emissions, getting paid to increase soil carbon, do you, don't you, how do you do it, what do you do? And the answer is, it doesn't really matter. Management options that increase soil carbon generally improve productivity, profitability, and sustainability through our soil health improvements. So, for people who want to target regenerative agriculture, they get a bonus, and their bonus is negative emissions and negative emissions agricultural products. If you are a person or a farmer, a landholder who wants to tackle negative emissions, the bonus is soil health through increased water holding capacity, drought resilience, less runoff, etc., and productivity improvements. So either way, in my opinion, you're going to be on a winner. So from the perspective, and it goes back to a question that we were asked a little bit earlier, is what can you guys do in this space? Not many of you are landholders or not past a quarter of an acre possibly. What you can do is you can agitate for labelling of products so that you know where they come from, you know whether they are sustainably produced with regards to their soil health, but also with regards to their broader environmental impacts, including the impact on the atmosphere. You can talk with anyone who will listen about any of these issues, and I suspect that I'm preaching to the converted on that one, and that you're a mob who are really good in that space. You can think about your own offsets. For most of you, it'll be things like flying. When you jump on your Qantas, your Virgin, your Jetstar, your Tiger Air flight, can you tick a box that says that you'll be carbon neutral? And if you are carbon neutral, what sort of integrity standards sit behind that carbon offset scheme? It's worth thinking about, because some of the voluntary schemes are not necessarily sitting against a really good set of standards and those integrity principles. You can volunteer in projects and in programs in different ways, obviously locally, but also more broadly in the farming sphere. You can grow your own vegetables, which is kind of cool, and that gets you connected to the world, your own world, to connect to the soil, connected to the seasons, and connected to your environment. And you can teach your kids, you can tell them what's what. So thank you. Yeah, super keen to hit the questions.
Okay, we have quite a few questions actually. So Fiona had a question just in relation to the take up of regenerative agriculture in Australia. I'll just let Fiona ask her question.
Hi, yeah, thank you. So I was just wondering, I've read the Australian farmer Charles Massey's book called Call of the Reed Warbler, and he talks about, he's done some case studies on regenerative farming practices in Australia. So I was just wondering, in your experience, what's the reaction of farmers towards this practice generally, and is there much of a move towards a take-up of more regenerative practices?
Yes, look, I'm diddling with my bizzo here. I'm trying to get everyone's picture on. Sorry, I changed it. Call of the Reed Warbler is the most amazing book. I know Charles Massey quite well. He's a lecturer here at ANU and has done some fantastic work in that space, which doesn't answer any of the questions you just asked. There is a real change in thinking. I was an agronomist 20 odd years ago, and you never would have spoken about regenerative agriculture. I don't even think the term existed. People were starting to talk about land care and sustainability, mainly because of salinity and soil acidity. And it's changed now. I was at the West Australian Soils Conference in February, and there was a lot of people asking a lot of questions about regenerative agriculture. I think that all of the soil metrics are now being recognised as going downhill. I showed you the soil carbon one. There's, soil acidity, soil compaction, etc. And so there is a lot of interest in regenerative agriculture, much more than I'd probably given credit to. Just exactly directly to this, I worked on the National Land Care Program, and there was a little bit of a talk, but not much, about regenerative agriculture. So it really is starting to become much more the flavour of the day. And part of it is to do with reduced inputs, which are getting more and more expensive. people looking at their sustainability, but also looking at that really long-term big picture and thinking much more about moving away from that industrial farming to a much softer way to farm.
And so just, I guess, following on from that, so what proportion of Australian agriculture would be regenerative at the moment, do you think? So is it 2% or is it more?
I don't think it would be 2%. I'd actually like to know the answer to that question. I don't think it would, maybe it would, yeah, it wouldn't be any more than that. It really is very small proportion. There's a mob called Soils for Life who do a lot of, they've got 30 case studies going for regenerative agriculture practices in all sorts of different agroecological zones across Australia. And it's super fun talking to them about their case studies. And I think that more and more people are getting involved. And the other thing that tends to happen in the transition to regenerative agriculture and really taking on board those principles that I talked about during the talk is that a farmer, won't necessarily do it across the farm on day one. They'll go, I think I might do a bit of regen principles in this paddock or in this area. I'm going to suck it and see. I'm going to see how it goes. And then look at the production, look at what happens. Because classically, in the short term, your profitability often declines for adoption. So you'll get a bit of a lull in profitability and then you'll restabilise to a new equilibrium, and then you'll see increased profits due to the particularly reduced expensive inputs.
And so I'll just throw another question. How long does it take for a farm to get, so there's obviously a dip and it goes back, how long would it take for a farmer who started as moving to regenerative agriculture to regain the profitability that they had prior perhaps to how long is that transition period? And is that a huge barrier to the adoption of these practices?
It depends where you've come from and quite where you're going to. And that probably sounds like a really loose answer. But if you're adopting a couple of simple techniques, like you're moving to, I always think of no-till, but if you're moving, into a no-till system, or you're changing a rotation, or you're going into mixed species cropping, that sort of thing, you can expect to see probably 2 years of profit reduction in that paddock and before it starts picking up. But if it's something that's quite a lot more complex than that, and you're going from an absolute monoculture into pasture cropping or something quite complex, then it's probably more like 5 years. And depends on the seasons, of course. You cop a drought in there, and of course it's we're all in trouble. But yeah, that's the type of thing you'd see. And once again, it depends. If you say, oh look, I'll do it in this subcatchment on my farm or in this paddock or something like that. To me, that's a sensible way, is to understand the principles and adopt them slowly. It's not a total flip on one day. You can adopt those principles in time as you go.
Great. Jackie had another question just about disturbing the soil, and a question about aerating the soil versus oxidising it. So maybe, Jackie, perhaps you can ask Sue your question. Oh, don't seem to have. Maybe you need to unmute yourself.
Jackie's unmuted.
Nope. Maybe we'll pass along. We had a question from, or your question, maybe Taryn, from Marion. Just do you want me to ask that question, or does Marion?
Sorry, Shane.
Sorry. So we had a question about: are any of the big agribusinesses interested in regenerative agriculture?
Not as enough as I would like.
Right. Okay.
Just to expand a little bit on that, one of the things that happens in regenerative agriculture is that inputs go down. So fertilizer and cropping inputs go down quite considerably, and so it depends where your push comes from in the commercial space. But the other thing is that regenerative agriculture is, I'd go out on a limb and say it's a more skilled thing than some of the conventional agriculture. So in your big farming operations, sometimes it's a case that let's just get this done. Let's bang it out. Let's get this done. Huge areas of more industrial farming, whereas the regen ag is a little bit more tweaked and a little bit more family farm friendly, you could say. So, yeah.
Right. Andy, you had another question as well. I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, I've heard that just fencing off stock from our farmlands can just allow the native seed that's in there to regrow, and this might be part of one of those pathways that you were talking about, farmers being able to get some credit for things that they weren't going to do beforehand. But would it be better for the environment if all the farmers just took the stock off the land?
Yes and no, and it depends what the land is, and also it depends if we still need agricultural production. So there's quite a big balance in there. So there's a number of components to that question. I'm thinking of a top of a hill that's got some remnant vegetation in, and when you talk about fencing that off from stock, and then it'll reseed and regrow. It does. It's wonderful. So you can fence off some of those remnant vegetation bush blocks, and in 15, 20 years' time, they will look totally different because there'll be an understory, there'll be lots of native grasses, there'll be saplings of otherwise big trees coming through. So it'll be really different. And I think that that's a really important thing to be doing. Farmers often will use those areas as stock refuge during storms. So what they can do is actually have it fenced off and have no stock in there for probably 2 or 3 years. And then if they know there's a sheep warning or there's a big storm coming, they'll let the stock in, they'll stay there for a day, just while the storm passes, pull them back out again. So that's quite legitimate. But the other thing that animals do on a rotational and on a pasture basis is they actually help recycle nutrients, and they do so in quite an efficient manner, really through their manure. So to take stock completely out of the system isn't necessarily efficient. And if you think about a grazing stubbles, so animals will quite often come across and graze crop stubbles. They'll pick up spilt grain and spilt any straw, any flag leaf that's still got a bit of nutrition in it. They'll pick it up, turn it into manure and recycle all of those nutrients, which is of value to the system. So I think that was the 2 questions. Yeah, I think that was it.
Great. Just one more from me. I mean, how much, what is the potential for storing, I guess, so I'm assuming that climate change mitigation is not typically what this government wants to talk about, or that's a major focus of when you talk to farmers. I guess it's just about improving productivity and improving soil, water retention. You're not really talking about the climate change benefits, I assume. When can we pitch to government that this might be a climate change mitigation strategy, or is that just too hard to talk to government about using building carbon in soil as a climate change mitigation strategy?
Yeah, well, they do have those 2 soil carbon methods. Clearly, they're not well adopted, and there's some good reasons for that, which I explained earlier. I think the Australian government is still working in that space. Look, it's a difficult hot potato in the climate space. People sometimes have a propensity to overestimate the amount of sequestration that Australian soils can do. Like, we have quite poor sandy soils and low rainfall, so soil carbon's always going to be low in Australian soils. But the point of it is, I think, is probably is really like this. It doesn't matter whether you improve your soil carbon for regenerative agriculture, for soil health, or for climate benefits. You just got to hook in and do it, you know, to improve that sustainability. So when I'm talking to farmers, I generally will focus on their sustainability and their productivity. I do also talk a little bit about emissions, but it depends on the audience and depends where we're going with that, who it is, etc. in that space. I'd have to tread a little bit carefully. But a lot of farmers, I mean, one of the things, the really big impediments to adopting either of the soil carbon methods is the difficulties and the uncertainty involved. You know, is that measuring soil carbon is really expensive across the paddock. It costs much more to measure than you're ever going to get back in soil carbon credits. So it comes down to, well, just do it because you know it's a good idea, not because you're going to get paid for it. Some people will want to get paid to make a point, but personally, I think it's a pretty expensive way to make a point. And I think that not everything's about money. You know, sometimes you just do things because it's right. And that's something that I will talk to farmers about a lot. Do it because it's right.
Right. Perfect. I just think we might ask the question that Jackie had, and we might wrap up on that. So her question was relating to disturbing soil. So when you till soil, what's the difference between aerating soils and then causing the oxidation of the organic matter in the soil? So obviously there's a balance, or when do you want to disturb soil for aeration versus when is it a problem in terms of?
Yeah, what's going on there? Yeah. Here's the thing, right? If you never do, like, a completely natural soil has got a marvelous soil structure that if you open it up, it breaks into these big aggregates that have got really good pore spaces in it, so that your roots, your root hairs, your fungal hyphae can really easily penetrate the soil. There's no compaction problems. You don't see compaction in that normal undisturbed native soils. And water can infiltrate really well. Erosion is at an absolute minimum. So you sort of think, well, that's pretty cool. Let's aim for that. Let's not disturb the soil. The exact opposite to that is a highly disturbed agricultural soil that compacts really. Sorry, my computer battery's running out. It compacts really easily. You get surface compaction and you get subsurface compaction, and that's partly due to the rain hitting the surface and compacting the very surface, and also due to heavy machinery running all over the soil when it's doesn't have any roots to hold it together, and often if it's wet, you know, it'll pug down and compact. So if you balance that out between what you might think of as aerating the soil, and I'm thinking of a golf course, you know, where they go with those little pricky machines and they aerate the soil that way. That's because it's an artificial system. You know, you've often only got one species and a few weeds, but basically one species. You know, a bit of couch grass, you mow it, you know, and you make it all flat and smooth and everything. And that's why it needs aerating, because it's not a natural system. So if you had, I don't think you can do it, a golf green with lots of species. But if you did, I'm not a golfer, if you had a golf green with lots of species, you'd find that the problem was a lot less, because you've got different types of roots doing different jobs. You know, you've got a taproot like a carrot, and you've got a fibrous root system, and you've got surface fibrous roots, you've got deep fibrous roots, etc. That they all come together to form that really good soil structure. So the only time you need to aerate a soil per se is when you've got a compaction issue, and you've got your compaction issue because you've by and large got a monoculture and you've got machinery. That was a long answer, sorry.
No, perfect. On that note, I wanted to say, Sue, thank you very, very much for talking to us this evening. It's been really appreciated. I'm sure it's enhanced our collective knowledge immeasurably. So yes, thank you very, very much. And I might just hand back to Jeff for a few closing words.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Shane. And yeah, just echo that, Sue. Really interesting presentation. Thank you so much for your generosity with your time. I wonder if is there a way that people can follow up with you? Are you happy to share the slides, for example? Are you happy to share an email? I'm not sure. What are you comfortable with if people want to learn more?
Yeah, look, super happy to share the slides. I can email them to Shane's probably the best idea.
Yeah, and we can get them out, sure.
Yep, they're all referenced. Well, those diagrams are all referenced where they came from. If anybody wants to, seek further information, you can click on the links that are on the references down the bottom of each slide. Otherwise, it's just out of my head. Sorry about that. And so, yeah, super welcome to do that. Also, I'll share with Shane just the details about the Office of the National Soils Advocate in time if anybody would like to contact myself or the new National Soils Advocate when they're on board.
Excellent, cool. No, thank you so much for that. And that way we can sort of keep the conversation going.
Yep, no problem.
Thank you to everybody else who joined as well. I hope you all got something out of it. Look out on our Facebook page on our mailing list for our next session. So again, the third Wednesday of June it will be. I'm not sure of the date. It might be the 17th. Don't quote me on that. And we're going to have a speaker talking about biochar, which Sue referenced. So it'll build nicely on this topic. But again, look out for the invites for that. But otherwise, thank you all, and we'll sign off and wish you a pleasant evening.
Are we going to debrief?
Yeah, Marion had a question before. She's.
I'll unmute. Yes, I mean it's typical of everything that things are pulling in two different directions, and you probably heard that the COVID committee, which is obviously led by the mining executives, and also now I've learned it's a senior executive with Dow Chemicals, proposes that Australia becomes a leader in gas and chemical fertilizers, manufacturing chemical fertilizers. But there is a Senate inquiry going on at the moment, and we can actually make submissions to that Senate inquiry. So I'm doing something, and if I could send the link to somebody and other people could send something in, it's by the 28th of May. That they need to be, but I mean, clearly what's happening with that committee is it's got no oversight at all. It's just been appointed, and it's not answerable to anybody.
I'm wondering if the best email is maybe the YCAN email.
Sure. Yes.
Yeah, I was about to type it in the chat, but I actually can't remember what it is.
info@ycan.org.au.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Nice to see you.
Yes, hi Marion. Good, thanks for coming.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It was great.
I've just put it in there. Thank you, Marion.
Yeah, thanks, Marion.
Okay.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye.
Hello.
Well.
Hi, I'm still here.
I like Jackie.
That's right.
I thought that was really good.
I'm still recording. Sorry, let me pause it.